Good morning. I'm Guy Cleaver, CEO of Dodds Group plc, one of the organisers of today's event. Thank you for all for joining us at the launch of Brexit Exchange. This is an interesting collaboration bringing together a wide range of partners who have one thing in common, which is to make sure that the voice of business from across the European Union is heard during the negotiation over the UK's exit from the EU. Over the coming months, we will be encouraging other organisations to come forward and support this initiative, whether that be publicly or in private, as we roll out a programme of events looking at the challenges being faced by different industry sectors, from financial services and energy to food and drink, agriculture, travel and tourism, etc. The output of these events will be a communique from the industry sector to politicians and officials across Westminster and Brussels on both sides of the negotiating table, with the intention of positively influencing the outcome. I hope you enjoy this morning's launch event and that this will give you a flavour of Brexit Exchange and what we're setting out to achieve. And now I would like to introduce our host, the economist, journalist and TV presenter, Evan Davis.
Thank you very much, Guy. Well, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm afraid they blotted out the view, so you can only see us and you can't be distracted by the joys of London behind us. We've got a morning ahead. I'm going to do some talking and I'm going to ask lots of questions, but you have to do some talking too, because this is an exchange, not a set of presentations. Now, I'm happy to be here because we've all been involved in lots of Brexit conversations, privately and publicly, over the last year. There's been a rather small playlist in those conversations of themes and things that people say. And what excites me about Brexit Exchange is the idea that the conversation might move on to some, if you like, more detail. So there are sort of four things that I think are good about Brexit Exchange. One is that it's not a political conversation. It's a much more business-focused one. Two, it'll be a bit more detailed, so we won't just hear about customs union, yes or no. We might get a bit deeper into it. Three, we actually have, unusually for the British conversation, some non-British Europeans in the room to share the conversation with us, which seems like a really helpful contribution to debate. And fourthly, what is great about this morning, and I urge you to stick to this, is that we're not going to discuss whether Brexit is a good idea or not. People will have their views about whether it's a good idea. This is about making the best of it as possible. And if your answer is, well, let's make the best of it by reversing it, just hold your tongue on that thought for the time being, because this is a bit more detail on making it work. The real goal of this morning is to see whether there is if there's something useful to be gained by the conversation. Or the organisers is to prove that there is something useful to be gained by the conversation. But this is, if you like, a kind of proof of concept or test of concept of Brexit Exchange, getting a lot of business in a room together and having a conversation about it. The schedule for this morning is a game of two halves. We'll have a conversation with the two people next to me for the next 25 minutes or so. We'll then have a session on the legal processes that will be taking us through the negotiation and internally in the UK. We'll then have a coffee break, and then there are going to be two other sessions, two panels in effect. One on the opportunities and risks of Brexit, and I hope you'll have a lot to say on that. And then a discussion to some extent on what you would like from a Brexit exchange. What is the sort of process here that would be useful for business as this whole thing drives forward? So that is the morning. We'll be done by 1:30. I have to be out of the building by 1:30, so I guarantee we'll be done by 1:30. But I want to start by talking to these two fine gentlemen next to me. Let me introduce them. Steffen Kampeter has been a German Member of Parliament for very many years. He was Parliamentary State Secretary to the Federal Minister of Finance, Wolfgang Schäuble. And then in 2016, last year, Steffen resigned his offices from federal politics and became Chief Executive of the German Employers Association, the BDA. So he is really the voice here of German employers. Next to him, Jonathan Powell, many of you will know, was Tony Blair's Chief of Staff for many years, 1995 to 2007, and was chief negotiator on the Northern Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement as well, and in fact uses a lot of that experience, brings that to bear in his new role as Director of Intermediate, which is an NGO which works on conflict resolution around the world. So I just want to get both of your perspectives, gents, and Steffen, because this conversation has mostly occurred in the UK, sometimes in the absence of any perspective from outside, and it's felt a little bit unreal. Maybe just give us a sort of flavour of where the Germans are on Brexit. Did they go through the sort of 5 stages of bereavement like many of the Brits? Are they over anger and denial and now in negotiation?
Actually, I'm not quite sure. No, I'm sure that you have to accept that the value of Brexit in public debates in Europe is a bit lower than the Brexit debate in your country. Apologies for that, but I have to tell you the truth. Number 2 is not only in Germany, but in general, I think rhetorical disarmament seems to be one of the key issues we have to work on. Not just only on one side, but on all sides. Because if there's a negotiation, and we have a chief negotiator sitting here, if you make your rhetoric like it's war or something like that, it will be very, very complicated to common ground. And number 3, I would say there is a bit. Some in Europe are wondering that this debate is about a penalty for the United Kingdom. I don't see that in that way. I would say we are in a divorce, and anybody in this room may have been through divorce. It's a complicated, emotional, and costly thing. So any divorce has some kind of price. And what I would recommend is start negotiating. Don't go on in fighting rhetorics. I think June number 10 will be a good day, or earlier, one day later, just to go on negotiating. And then we will step by step come to common ground. I think that is a type of European perspective, less emotional, less accusing, much interested in results.
And there's been some talk about how the negotiation can't really start until your general election. What date is it? September? You don't know either. Okay, so,
I can give you an answer.
Can it start?
I'd like to
can
remind
it get
everybody.
going?
I think there's one negotiation partner here in the UK whose election in June. And there's a European Commission who has a chief negotiator. I don't see any election over there. And if you see other elections, let's say in Austria predicted for October, or in Germany in December, as you might have felt that the self-confidence of European institutions is not only based on national elections, but on their mandate they have got by the EU 27 heads of state. And I'm not quite sure whether there will be a deal until Austrian or German election. I doubt. But there's no good reason for waiting until then.
Okay, so that's quite an important point. So, because I think a lot of British hope is vested in the idea that this will be a political discussion between nations. The Commission will kind of huff and puff and will have its mandate, but really the grown-ups will get in a room and stitch this up and make it work. But in a way, you're saying, well, actually, talk to the Commission.
Yes and no. The Commission is the defender of the treaty, and the treaty says what it's to do. Article 50, Article 218, and which is a delicate question, as everybody knows, which one comes first, a parallel or one for. But I'm not going too detailed in this. But the Commission is, of course, reflecting national interests. but the decision will be made on the EU 27 level. So it is not just to put out one list. It's not the German car producer that are directing the negotiation scheme bilaterally with the German government directly into Downing Street number 10. It is a balanced approach on the EU 27 level, and probably there shall be a balanced approach with different interests within this country.
Okay.
And this is the framework. Others take away all these myths. The crowds are not conquering UK election and all this stuff I read sometimes in the tabloids. Just that there is be aware that everybody knows in Europe, including the United Kingdom probably, this will be complicated, and if everybody who has a good will can deliver to a reasonable result. Probably not a result very soon, very complex. There might be phasing in and phasing out are options we have to take into consideration, but that probably will be more precise in the last 2 rounds of the election or something like that. And a deal is made when everything is dealt. So there might be interconnections with things, but this is much ahead. I repeat my recommendation for the sake of business. Businesses want that the politics is now starting to negotiate.
Jonathan, how ready, how prepared, how happy are you with the sort of setup as we kind of begin the process, which will start sort of June the 15th, basically?
Yes, I'm not very happy with the way the negotiations are starting, and I wouldn't have started from here. But I think, as Steffen says, the first thing we need to do is take the rhetoric out of this and try and get into negotiation. A negotiation has to be built on trust, and you can't do it if you're both shouting at each other. So hopefully once our elections are over, the shouting can stop and we can start getting into the negotiations proper. And I think actually the negotiations will not be conducted, or the meat of the negotiations will not be conducted between leaders. I think you'll find it's not Theresa May who's negotiating, it's not David Davis, it will be Ollie Robbins, the permanent secretary. At DEXU it will be the officials underneath him and the officials in UCREP who do the real work of this. And the more we can make this technical, the better. So I think if we take the politics out of this, as this initiative is intended to do, to make it more technical, I think that is what would be the most valuable way to start off these negotiations.
Aren't both sides grown up enough to know that everybody has their politics, and ultimately they have to kind of see through that? I mean, the Europeans are quite good at forgiving the kind of rhetoric that you take back home, and then you come into the meeting and you obviously... They understand, you've got your audience, your crowd to play to. I just wonder whether whether they should be letting the politics get in the way. I mean, a lot of this is quite dry.
I find the politics, in my experience, a long time in number 10 doing with this, is very asymmetric. Britain finds itself in a quite different position negotiating relative to the political climate back home. What happens to us is that our press are not generally supportive of a government, whichever government it might be, whereas most presses within the EU will tend to support what the government is trying to do in the EU and present what they come back with as a success. For our press, if we go in asking for huge amounts of huge things, we are then presented as a failure when we come back not having achieved those things because we've made compromises. If we ask for very modest things when we go in, then we're criticised, is that all you're asking for? Why aren't you asking for much more than that? So either way, the Prime Minister is condemned to be a failure in negotiations, and that, of course, is what David Cameron found out, and that's what Theresa May will find out in this negotiation. So the politics is not the same. Of course, the European leaders understand we have politics. I don't think they really understand our politics.
Right. And Jonathan, just in terms of the structure, so Theresa May, first action really was to create this departmental structure, international trade, Boris at the Foreign Office, and DEXEU, the department. Is that the right structure? Have we got that right?
But it's the structure we have, and that's what we're going to have to work with. What I worry about a bit is the lack of European experience in our team. And most of the really experienced people in these kind of European negotiations have left. Ivan Rogers most recently, but a whole series of others. We're left with people who are extremely bright, who I've worked much of my career with, and will learn very fast, but they do not have that granular experience of difficult trade negotiations, difficult EU negotiations that the people on the other side of the table in the Commission and the Council will have. And we'll be really struggling to catch up with that.
Right, I'm going to open up for questions in a sec, but I just want to talk about the role of business in this. So, Stefan, the line that has been commonly asserted here is that business will be a force for a sensible deal, and the German car makers and the Italian Prosecco providers or whoever will insist that, you know, the governments keep trade open and don't play hardball in a way that sort of obstructs trade. Now, what is your perception about how, if you like, how strong the business voice will be and how much that voice will be in favour of things that might be perceived useful to British business, which is essentially, you know, business as usual, trade, tariff-free, as, you know, bureaucratically free as possible?
If you listen to voices not only from Germany, including car makers and others, the top priority of the European business is the integrity of the internal market. So this is the market of 2027. In the second row, the top priority is making good business with the UK. And we will see during the negotiation whether there's a conflict between these two. For example, I'm not quite sure whether Paris, Amsterdam, Frankfurt and London have the same expectation on the detailed transitional agreement for financial passporting, yes and no. There might be conflict, but in general, the business expectation is, the clear message to politics is make business viable between EU and UK. And, but do not harm the integrity of our internal market, for example, by cherry-picking deals. And therefore, we're taking on two shoulders. We have a clear communication and strong cooperation with our British partners, especially with the CBI as a strong voice of British industries, and there's an intense collaboration between the financial intermediates and their representation and the European ones. But this will show whether we have conflicts there. Our aim is to find a reasonable solution. And that is why what Business Exchange can deliver. They can deliver facts and examples to the negotiators from sectors, from very good examples. I do not, nobody can expect from your team or the Barnier team to know every detail. Where is the conflict? Some have been popped up, like open sky arrangement, what shall we do, or something like that. The financial passporting is really. But if you read the questions of the Japanese government in last September, delivered to the UK and European administration, you see how detailed they have. What is going on with my foreign direct intervention? What are the capital flows possibilities with my foreign Japanese direct intervention? It's not just only a question between EU and the UK. We have to take into consideration that businesses are not just located in these two fields. We have third-party members, and the more detailed and the more rational we deliver information to the technical stuff below the political negotiation, we can bring rationality into the process.
Can I just pick up on 2 points that Stefan made? The first is, I think on the single market, it's really important to understand. And what Angela Merkel said yesterday, I think, is crucial to this regard. That if we do not accept the four freedoms, we do not accept the freedom of movement, we cannot have the same terms as the single market. And the notion that David Davis put forward that we would have exactly the same access for our trade and the connections with the single market cannot be right. Therefore, what we're negotiating is a different sort of agreement than the single market, and that is going to be very difficult and extraordinarily complex, the most complex negotiations I've seen in my lifetime. So picking up on the second point that Stefan makes is, I think the reason why this initiative could be potentially so valuable is we need something that takes the politics out of this, that looks at it from a technical point of view rather than a purely political point of view. That secondly is a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down. Having worked my whole life in government, these negotiations are conducted by civil servants from a political perspective, from a top-down perspective. They do not know about the supply chains for the car manufacturers or the agri-industry in Ireland. And those thoughts are going to have to be put up to the negotiators to take into account. because there are not going to be sectoral agreements in this agreement. It's going to be across the board. So if there's going to be a problem for the chicken industry in Ireland or for the car industry between Britain and Germany, then someone needs to reflect those ideas to the negotiators themselves. And the third reason why I think this is really valuable is that it would be pan-European. For the last year, we've really been negotiating with ourselves in the UK and just talking to ourselves and developing a perfect position, which is great, but actually we're going to have to negotiate with someone else, which is the 27 members of the EU. And unless we can talk business to business across Europe, we're going to end up with a zero-sum game. So I really think that could be valuable because of those three aspects.
Am I not right? In essence, the important negotiation is the one between the 27, isn't it? Because once they've fixed a position, it's credible for them to say, look, I'm sorry, guys, it's just too hard for us to fix a different position. We've spent, quite a lot of time arguing this one out. We can't,
no.
We don't have the discretion to alter it. Is that fair? Or is it going to be a negotiation?
It may be true, but it must not be true. Now the thing is, if you see the lines Michel Barnier gave in the European Parliament, I think the day before yesterday, so he is delivering a much more compromising tone than the guidelines have delivered. So there seems to be a growing flexibility in the process, which I very much appreciate from the business point of view. But the EU 27 do know that we have to solve 2 or 3 questions first, and then we get much more into detail. Residents, money, Northern Ireland, these 3 are probably, as we see on the top agenda. And there may be an option then to combine Article 50 with Article 218, I think. So the divorce agreement and the future agreement, and step by step we go forward. And everybody who is professional in this process knows that flexibility on both sides is key. It is not just, there will be no solution if the big 27 are trying to bash that one. And I don't see, aside the rhetorics, talking to government officials and European officials, everybody knows that flexibility is key. But on the other hand, you have to be aware there should be you cannot over-promise with the danger of under-delivering. So that's the rhetorical thing. Yeah. And I think Jonathan rightly put out that we're not working for the tabloids, we're working for substantial agreements, and everybody has to be aware that over-promising makes negotiating much more complicated, and under-delivering makes the result politically challenging for everybody.
Yeah, but I do think you're right about the 27, though, Stefan, Evan. That is really the crucial point, that it's so hard for the 27 to agree on something that once they've agreed on it, it will be incredibly difficult to unpick it, because there are very different interests at stake. So if you're the Polish Prime Minister, you've got issues about free movement that are not shared necessarily by the Germans, but they have access questions. So once they've agreed, and I had personal experience this ages ago in the CSC negotiations, where we would meet as the EU at 12, and we would agree something, and then we'd go to the NATO caucus, and they would say to us, but you have to change that position. And we say, sorry, we can't change it. We're 12, we agreed that, so that's our position. And that's going to be the problem that we face. Now, of course, as Stefan says, there's going to have to be compromise. Right. I fear the British side doesn't understand the need for that compromise.
Right, so but the issue here is actually, and you mentioned it, there's top-level stuff and there's detailed stuff, whether it's the sort of bottom-up chicken farmers arrangements for the Irish chicken farmers, and there's the kind of the big picture stuff which the civil servants are probably more comfortable dealing with. There will have to be flexibility
on the civil servants who shall deliver the technical stuff. It's us here as the business community. Right. I cannot expect from any civil servant to know how we run our businesses. At least so precisely they should know for a deal. So it's not the technical stuff is not stuff only for municipal servants. It's a stuff where municipal servant and business have to outwork a dialogue.
The point I just want to throw something on the table. If this is going to be a detailed discussion, this is going to take 10 years or 5 years. This is not going to happen in the kind of timescale we're talking about before we leave. What can be done in the timescale before we leave is just big level stuff, which is hopefully cutting and pasting large bits of stuff and saying carry on as we are. You know, if we have to go through every little arrangement for pet passports and
then we will hear three words: phasing in, phasing out, and transition. That's the answer to your question. I cannot make it more precise. I personally, this is not an official statement, I personally do not believe that we will have an Article 15 and an Article 218 agreement, so divorce and future arrangement at the end of the period we are looking at. So if we start, probably we will go on fast, and you might contradict, but at the end things are always getting complicated, and if you don't have whether the pressure of the deadline is so easy to get, probably there might be a part of the deal, at least to my expectation, transitional agreements, phasing in, phasing out, as we have to see, and therefore actually the will of compromise on both sides is necessary. I haven't met anybody who is working on that issue in detail who is betting that we have an agreement at the end of the full thing at the end of the next 1.5 years.
Does anybody want to make a point, raise a question? Yes, over here. They're roving mics. You're on the record, by the way. And can you tell us who you are? That's helpful.
Yeah, Charlotte Morgan from Linklaters. I just wanted to talk a little bit about whether we could change the nature of the debate, because we're all diving down into the detail and we're saying how we're going to negotiate all the detail of a free trade agreement, like, you know, whether it's beekeepers or German car manufacturers or how we make the supply chain work. Shouldn't we actually just take a step back and say that this is different from any free trade negotiation we've had before? Free trade negotiations normally relate to countries who don't have free trade to start with. We need to turn this on its head and, as business, say to the politicians, this isn't a free trade negotiation. We've got free trade, complete free trade. What we want to do is to maintain that, whether through transitional arrangements or in the longer term. And we want you to say to us, as politicians, which parts of industry do you not want to have free trade in? Because that's a much harder debate for the politicians to have. And as business, we should be saying, we want the status quo. We've got completely open trade now. We want to keep it.
So you start with the default. The counter example is not, restricted trade. It's where we are. And that would allow, Jonathan, that would allow you to cut through a debate about all the detail, apart from the bits which you're unpicking.
That would be wonderful if we weren't leaving the single market and we weren't leaving the EU. Unfortunately, in my view, politicians have decided that or people have decided that we are going to leave the EU. If we're leaving the single market and we're not prepared to accept the four freedoms, as Angela Merkel said yesterday, there will not be continued membership of the single market in terms of free trade for the UK. So we will have to negotiate, as Theresa May put forward in her speech in Lancaster House, a free trade agreement. That free trade agreement, as you quite correctly say, will not be negotiated in the next 16 months. That will take 5 to 10 years to negotiate.
But doesn't it make a difference, as the point was being made, that we're starting from a position of free trade? Isn't it much easier, by a factor of 10, to negotiate a free trade agreement from a point of where you've started at free trade?
There's the conflict between the integrity of the single markets and the four freedoms and the wish of the business that we shall have the thing. Your proposal is actually the proposal he doesn't want to hear. That is, go back on the pre-Brexit scenario and make a deal that fixes the pre-Brexit scenario. And it may be, I may be a pessimist, but you're an optimist, but on the outline probably we won't get to your point. So my view, it will be, the future arrangement will be some B-tip or something like that, will be as complicated as we have on CETA and on TTIP worked, and we will have transitional arrangement like we had on all other free trade agreements. So you think it will be that, we're going to hear from people involved in CETA, you think it is that complicated, and it needs to be that complicated. You can't basically say existing arrangements apply, except blah, 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 blah. That is, whether you, this is technicality, but the aim must be, there will be something different than the previous status quo, and you have to outline it. Whether we put a 0-1 or 1-0 option, it's a technicality, But in general, we have to go something through like a TTIP or BTIP or something, whatever you call it.
Yeah, come back.
I just wanted to come back on one thing. I mean, there are two ways to negotiate a free trade agreement. One is with a positive approach and one is with a negative approach. The positive approach, basically you start from the bottom, as Jonathan was saying, and you go, you know, I don't have trade here yet. You know, what am I going to allow? What market access am I going to allow? The other way, which is the way CETA was negotiated, which is that you look at it's a negative approach, which sounds negative, but actually isn't. It's positive. It's basically in unless you specify it's out. And it just seems to me that that approach, that secondary approach, which is the negative approach, is actually much more beneficial for business, and that's what business should be lobbying for, which is you take the approach that everything is in unless it's out, and so you can get to a much quicker. It's the default.
It's an argument. Okay, hold those thoughts, because we'll have time to come back to that. We've got a gentleman over here who I know wants to make a point.
Thank you. Dan Roberts from The Guardian. Evan, you said you wanted to get into the weeds, so I had a question about what seems to me to be the big first technical hurdle, which is timing and sequencing, with the Brits saying they want trade to run in parallel with the divorce talks and the EU saying they have to run sequentially. I wondered whether the panel felt that the ruling this week from the European Court of Justice on the Singapore trade deal helped that in any way, in that it appears to offer the chance that quite a large chunk of a trade deal could be done with executive competences kept within the EU, wouldn't have to be ratified by national parliaments. Does that offer a chink for perhaps some movement here on this key question of whether the talks have to be parallel or sequential?
Yeah. Both of you, quick comment on that one.
I do not feel that this is a legal question which comes first, but a political one. And therefore my recommendation, just start and see whether this political question is actually a real one. I can understand that the integrated approach is something which is in the interest of the UK government, and probably everybody in this room shall understand that the solution for the question money and residence is crucial for the European side. If you just start on one or two issues, I'm not quite sure whether the question which is now popping against is so relevant. And the Singapore thing is I wouldn't say do not make a legal question out of it. It is political. It's a political approach. That's the start.
I'm not competent to answer on the legal question about the judgment, but the people in this room who know a lot more than I do about this. But as I understand it, it doesn't change very much in terms of all of this. And Steffen says this is a political question, and you've got a face-off between us saying we want nothing agreed till everything is agreed, and them saying they want to agree it sequentially. I noticed what Barnier was saying yesterday I think, was that there needed to be substantial progress on those issues rather than concluding them. And you think about it logically, David Davis has a point. How could you possibly agree on what's going to happen on the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic until you've got some idea what you're transitioning to? So I think in the end that issue will be fudged.
And that, I was going to make the same point. It's surely this sequential versus parallel has been exaggerated as a hurdle. It'll disappear because we won't get to the end of the first part before we start the second part, and we're going to have an outline of the second part before we conclude the first part.
On money, first it was about 60 billion. Then the Financial Times make it about 100 million. Now we're talking about principles. I think that's a much more rational approach than if you go into the restaurant, your principal decide what the bill is at the end, and you pay at the end. So if you work on that one, on principle, you agree on principle, you will get much easier process than you're talking about figures. This is not a budget negotiation. It's about the principle, whether liabilities are paid or not, or what compromise between the two polar positions is. And if we deliver on principle, probably the money question goes much more less emotional on the table.
People will be working out what the principles imply for the actual bill at the end, of course, won't they? But I mean, I do agree that is the way to kind of cut through that. Okay, we'll take another quick couple of points over there, and then we're going to move on to the legalities. We're going to have plenty of time for sort of discussion. Steffen is going to be around on stage again later, so yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yes, good morning everyone. John Hicks from ACOM, so we're a professional business service firm that operates all over the world. This is very much an EU-focused conversation. From my perspective, I'm equally interested in the negotiations that we will have to do post-Brexit from both the, let's call it the European and the UK side, to other trading nations of the world. We mustn't also forget that this is a we have to look to both our futures, and that needs to play a part, I would have thought, in the Brexit exchange conversation.
Are you talking about new trade deals in terms of new opportunities, or about the complications of grandfathering, the
new trade deals going forward in the new world?
There's also the issue of the old trade deals that we're in via the EU and which then need to be transposed.
Yeah. It's not just only about third-party new trade between the UK. What about, for example, let's take the Japanese example again. The Japanese concern is how will you treat us for a business we try to as an entree into the EU made in the UK. So, and they are crucially asking the EU and the UK how to deal with it. So it's not just about trade, it's the transitional arrangements for businesses made by third parties out of the EU into the UK will be, at least to my impression, one part and not an easy one into the negotiation where businesses actually shall focus on.
Mm. And then a last comment there, and then I'm going to move on to the next session. Go ahead.
Michael Mashinsky, Chief Executive of London Advertising. It was announced today that UK unemployment is 4.6%, so it's undoubted that the UK businesses will want to have workers from the EU coming here. But in order to have the negotiation, I do think we need the politicians to prick this bubble of universal freedom of movement. I mean, does anyone here speak Latvian? Well, 74% of young people in the EU speak English. The idea that freedom of movement was universal and universal was the thing that actually we need to be redressed, because whilst we can offer a number of visas for people to work here, the idea it's uncontrolled was something the British public rejected.
Right, but there isn't going to be, it's none of our business whether the rest of the EU have free movement if we leave, and we're not having it, we've been told. But actually the conversation we should be in for that is up in Halifax in about half an hour, when the Tories tell us what their immigration policy is going to be. Right, look, I'd like to move on. Stefan, Jonathan, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. You're going to hear more.